Before the relationship officially ends, it almost always ends internally first. And this is where many people become confused, because nothing dramatic seems to happen on the surface. She is still there. She still responds. She still occupies the same physical space. But something essential has quietly vanished. Emotional presence. The warmth that once made connection feel alive begins to cool, not through open conflict, but through absence. From a psychological perspective, this withdrawal is not accidental. It is a gradual, strategic disengagement. The narcissistic woman begins to conserve emotional energy by pulling it away from genuine connection and redirecting it toward self-protection and image management. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the relationship stops being a meeting of two selves and becomes a stage for the ego. Intimacy, which requires vulnerability, becomes intolerable. So she retreats inward, leaving behind a version of herself that is functional but hollow. You may notice conversations becoming transactional. She listens but no longer hears. She responds but without curiosity. Empathy fades, replaced by neutrality or mild irritation. And because the withdrawal is subtle, you are often left questioning yourself. You try harder, explain more, give more, believing the distance is temporary or your fault. This is precisely why emotional withdrawal is so destabilizing. It creates an atmosphere of uncertainty that keeps you emotionally invested while she is already detaching. What is crucial to understand is that this withdrawal is not a reaction to something you suddenly did wrong. It is a reflection of her inner world. The narcissistic psyche struggles to sustain emotional closeness once the initial idealization phase ends. When real intimacy threatens the constructed self-image, retreat feels safer than honesty. So by the time the relationship ends outwardly, it has already ended inwardly. The bond has been severed quietly, without closure, without confrontation. If there is one insight to carry forward, it is this. When emotional presence disappears, love is no longer something to chase. It is something to recognize as already gone, and that recognition is the beginning of your freedom. After the emotional withdrawal begins, something even more subtle and far more disorienting starts to take place. The story of the relationship itself begins to change. Not abruptly, not openly, but quietly, revision by revision. Moments that once symbolized closeness are reinterpreted. Efforts you made out of care are reframed as control. Boundaries you set in self-respect are recast as selfishness. You may sense it happening, yet struggle to name it, because the past is being rewritten while you are still standing inside it. From a psychological standpoint, this narrative shift serves a defensive function. The narcissistic woman cannot tolerate the inner tension that comes from ending a relationship without moral justification. To preserve her self-image, the unconscious mind reshapes memory itself. Jung spoke of the ego's need to remain coherent at all costs. When reality threatens that coherence, the psyche bends perception rather than confronts truth. By altering the story, she transforms herself from participant into victim, from agent into reactor. This is why you may suddenly feel as though you are being judged by a standard that did not exist before. Past conflicts are selectively recalled, stripped of context, and used as evidence of a long-standing flaw in you. Meanwhile, her own contradictions vanish from the narrative entirely. This is not dialogue, it is psychological editing, and its effect is powerful. You begin to doubt your memory, your intentions, even your character. Confusion replaces clarity, and confusion weakens resistance. What makes this stage especially painful is that it robs you of shared reality. You are no longer discussing what happened. You are defending yourself against a version of events that feels unfamiliar and distorted. And yet, this distortion allows her to exit without guilt, convinced, at least on the surface, that the ending is justified. The deeper truth is this: when someone must rewrite history to leave you, the relationship was never anchored in truth to begin with. And the moment you stop arguing with a false narrative is the moment you reclaim your own. And that reclamation is where real psychological strength begins, as the inner separation deepens and the story of the relationship is quietly rewritten. The atmosphere between you begins to change in a more tangible way. What once felt like appreciation turns into correction. What once felt like intimacy becomes evaluation. Criticism enters not as an occasional disagreement, but as a constant tone. This is where many people begin to feel themselves shrinking, often without realizing why. Psychologically, this phase is rooted in projection. Carl Jung described projection as the act of disowning parts of oneself and placing them onto another. The narcissistic woman, unable to tolerate her own emerging sense of emptiness or inadequacy, externalizes it. You become the container for everything she cannot face within herself. Your mistakes are magnified, your strengths are diminished, and your individuality becomes an inconvenience rather than a gift. This devaluation rarely announces itself loudly. It comes through subtle comparisons, passive remarks, shifting standards. You may be praised one moment and criticized the next, leaving you disoriented and emotionally off balance. That instability is not accidental. It keeps you focused on regaining approval rather than questioning the dynamic itself. Over time, self-trust erodes. You begin to second-guess your perceptions, your reactions, even your worth. This is how power quietly changes hands. From a philosophical perspective, devaluation serves a dual purpose. It lowers you psychologically while elevating her sense of superiority, reinforcing the fragile structure of the narcissistic ego. At the same time, it creates emotional distance, making the eventual ending feel justified in her mind. If you are framed as flawed, disappointing, or difficult, leaving becomes easier to rationalize. But here is the essential truth. Sustained criticism is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that the relationship has stopped being a place of mutual recognition. When love turns into judgment, connection has already been replaced by control. And the moment you recognize devaluation for what it is, you stop trying to earn respect from someone who can only feel whole by diminishing you. And that recognition is the first act of reclaiming your inner authority. Once criticism and devaluation have weakened your sense of stability, a new behavior often emerges, one that is less visible but deeply revealing. She begins to test the limits of her control. Not directly, not openly, but through subtle emotional experiments designed to measure how tightly you are still bound to her approval. These tests are not about understanding you, they are about confirming her power. From a psychological perspective, this stage reflects the narcissistic need for dominance in moments of perceived loss. As her emotional investment fades, she seeks reassurance that she still matters, still influences you, still exists as the central figure in your inner world. Jung would describe this as the ego's fear of disintegration. When the external mirror begins to crack, the psyche grasps for proof that it can still shape reality. You may notice sudden coldness followed by warmth, distance followed by just enough attention to pull you back in. She might provoke jealousy, threaten separation, or withdraw affection without explanation, then observe your response. Do you chase? Do you over-explain? Do you abandon your own boundaries to restore harmony? Each reaction becomes data. The more you collapse inward to preserve the relationship, the more control she believes she holds. What makes this phase particularly dangerous is that it masquerades as normal relationship tension. You tell yourself this is just a rough patch, that if you respond correctly, balance will return. But the dynamic has already shifted. The relationship is no longer a shared space, it is a testing ground. Your emotional reactions become the currency through which power is measured. Philosophically, this is the moment where choice quietly presents itself, to remain entangled or to reclaim agency. Because control only exists where consent is unconsciously given. The moment you stop reacting, stop chasing, stop negotiating your worth, the test fails. And when the test fails, the illusion of power collapses. So the insight to carry forward is simple but demanding. Anyone who needs to test your devotion before leaving has already replaced love with dominance. And the instant you choose self-respect over emotional obedience, you step out of the experiment and back into yourself. As the tests of control reveal their results, another pattern quietly emerges. She begins to secure a new source of validation. This is not always obvious at first, and it does not necessarily mean a new romantic partner is immediately involved. Often it can be a friend, an admirer, a social circle, or even a personal project that mirrors the admiration, attention, or emotional reflection she craves. The narcissistic psyche cannot tolerate emptiness. It must constantly be reflected, reinforced, and elevated. Jung would describe this as an externalization of the self, a desperate search for mirrors that validate the ego when internal reflection fails. This stage is significant because it reveals the true nature of the relationship. While you may have invested in emotional intimacy, loyalty, or shared growth, her focus has already shifted. Your presence is no longer the source of her affirmation. Instead, she seeks new channels to feed the part of herself that must always appear whole, accomplished, and admired. In essence, she is preparing the psychological groundwork to exit without confronting the discomfort of loneliness or incompleteness. You may notice small signs: increased attention to her appearance, sudden interest in new social opportunities, or a subtle withdrawal that coincides with increased energy elsewhere. These behaviors are often framed innocuously, so you may rationalize them as normal life changes. Yet beneath these shifts lies a pattern of replacement, a silent message that your emotional availability is no longer sufficient to sustain her ego. From a philosophical perspective, this teaches a hard truth about dependency and projection. If someone cannot find satisfaction in the shared life you created and must look elsewhere for affirmation, their departure is not about your inadequacy. It is about the unintegrated parts of their psyche seeking reflection outside themselves. The insight here is profound. When a person begins lining up their next source of validation, it is not a personal failure. It is an inevitable consequence of their inner emptiness. Recognizing this early frees you from the trap of trying to compete with illusions. And the moment you accept that your value does not depend on being someone else's mirror, you reclaim not only your self-worth, but also the clarity to walk away without regret. By the time the relationship reaches its visible conclusion, it often feels abrupt, even shocking. One day everything seems as it was, and the next, the end is declared. Yet for the narcissistic woman, the breakup is rarely sudden. The decision has been made long before you sense it, quietly solidified in her inner world, while you were still navigating the confusion of withdrawal, devaluation, and testing. What feels sudden to you is actually the final act of a process that has been unfolding for weeks, months, or even years. This stage is marked by a striking emotional detachment. She often presents the ending as inevitable, logical, or even merciful. There is little room for negotiation, apology, or reconciliation. To her, framing the departure as preordained protects her fragile self-image, allowing her to exit without confronting guilt or vulnerability. Psychologically, this reflects a classic narcissistic pattern, externalizing responsibility while maintaining the illusion of moral or rational superiority. Jung would recognize this as a defense of the ego, a way to preserve psychic coherence when reality threatens it. For those on the receiving end, the impact is destabilizing. You may feel blindsided, betrayed, or humiliated by the abruptness. Yet the truth lies in the invisible stages preceding the breakup: the withdrawal, the narrative rewriting, the devaluation, the tests, and the search for new validation. The final departure is simply the externalization of a decision that has been quietly enacted all along. The crucial insight here is that endings are rarely as sudden as they appear. What seems like an unexpected loss is actually the culmination of patterns and behaviors you may have sensed but could not fully name. Recognizing this allows you to reclaim clarity and perspective. You see that the ending was never about a single incident, a single failure, or a sudden change in your worth. It was about the inevitable path she had chosen for herself. And this recognition carries power. The moment you understand that the breakup reflects her inner reality, not your inadequacy, you step out of confusion and into awareness. You are no longer a participant in her narrative. You are the observer of your own life. And in that awareness lies your freedom, your dignity, and the first step toward a future built on authenticity rather than illusion.